Hernandez. You know, if they were giving out awards this year for the most improved wrestler of the year, I think they'd give it to you, Genius. You've changed. You've changed almost overnight. Your wrestling style and everything about you. You've become a winner.
Hercules Hernandez. Remember that name. He was everything you wanted in a wrestler. The look, the power, the experience. He should have been a massive WWF star, but he wasn't. Why? That's the story we're unpacking today. From tag team glory to backstage fights, and a career that promised so much but maybe delivered less. This is the story of Hercules.
255 pounds from Bad Street, Hercules Hernandez.
In the 1980s, WWF was all about big personalities and strong wrestlers. Hercules Hernandez fit right in. With his tall, muscular build, he looked like a true wrestling star. He competed in several WrestleManias and went up against some of the biggest names of that time. Born on May 7, 1956, Hercules had everything needed to be a top wrestling star. But somehow, he never quite made it to the top in the WWF. He had his moments, but for most of his career, he was stuck in the middle of the card, always on the edge of something bigger, but never quite breaking through. Instead of being a major star, he was often used to help build up younger wrestlers, making them look good at his own expense. Back in the late 1980s, it seemed like Hercules was on his way up. He was getting solid matches, had some big wins, and was even part of a major storyline with Ted DiBiase. But by 1988, things started slowing down. Instead of being pushed higher, he was mostly there to put over other guys. Take WrestleMania 6 in 1990 as an example. He was put in a match against Earthquake, a huge, unstoppable villain that WWF was building up as a major threat. The match lasted less than 4 minutes, and Hercules was completely squashed. That was his role at that point, being the guy that made others look strong. By 1991, he was regularly losing on TV, and any momentum he once had was long gone. For a brief moment, it seemed like things might turn around when he formed a tag team with Paul Roma. They called themselves Power and Glory and had some decent success in 1990. They looked like a promising duo, with Hercules as the powerhouse and Roma bringing speed and agility. They even had some exciting matches. But then came WrestleMania 7 in 1991, and everything fell apart. They were put in a match against the Legion of Doom, and it lasted less than a minute. Just like that, Power and Glory were done. It was almost as if the WWF had completely given up on them overnight. Not long after, Roma left WWF, and Hercules was back to being a singles wrestler with no real direction. His final months in the company were filled with loss after loss, whether it was against top stars like Big Boss Man and Sid Justice, or even lower-tier wrestlers. He wasn't a serious threat anymore, and it was clear that his time in WWF was coming to an end. Before he even made it to WWF, Hercules had a moment that nearly ended his career before it really took off. In 1985, while wrestling in Championship Wrestling from Florida, he got into a fight in the locker room with veteran wrestler Wahoo McDaniel. Wahoo was a respected name in the business, known for being tough as nails. Backstage fights weren't unheard of in wrestling, but this one had major consequences. Hercules was fired from the promotion and stripped of the 2 titles he held at the time. It was a serious setback, but in a way, it led him to WWF, where he got his biggest opportunities. After leaving WWF in early 1992, Hercules tried to restart his career in WCW. The company gave him a new character, calling him Super Invader. He wore a mask and was supposed to be an Oriental assassin managed by Harley Race. The whole gimmick felt forced, and fans never really bought into it. It was clear that WCW was just throwing ideas at the wall, hoping something would stick. He had a couple of minor wins, like at Wrestle War 1992 and a multi-man tag match at Clash of Champions 20. But beyond that, his WCW run was forgettable. By the end of the year, he was out of the company, and his career was fading fast. It was a disappointing run, especially since he had hoped for a fresh start outside of WWF. Instead, he found himself in an even worse position, struggling to stay relevant in a company that had no real plans for him. His final match in WWF wasn't on TV, but fans who were there still talk about it. In early 1992, he wrestled Sid Justice at Madison Square Garden. The match ended quickly, with Sid pinning him after a powerbomb. But instead of staying down and selling the move like wrestlers are supposed to, Hercules got up immediately and walked out. It was clear that he was frustrated. He had been losing so much that he just didn't care anymore. Breaking character like that is rare in wrestling, and it showed just how done he was with being treated like an afterthought. It was almost a silent protest, a way of saying, "I'm not playing this game anymore." Hercules wasn't really known for major scandals, but he was involved in a few moments that were controversial in wrestling history. One of the biggest was in 1988 when Ted DiBiase tried to buy him from his manager, Bobby Heenan. The storyline was meant to make Hercules look like a hero when he refused to be treated like property. But the idea of a wrestler being sold, especially a Hispanic wrestler, made a lot of people uncomfortable. The crowd cheered when Hercules stood up for himself, but looking back, it was a storyline that probably should have never happened. Many fans and critics later pointed out how bad it looked, and it remains one of the more infamous storylines from that era. The fight with Wahoo McDaniel back in 1985 was another moment that hurt his career. Backstage fights weren't common knowledge to fans at the time, but getting fired over one was a big deal. If WWF hadn't given him a chance shortly after, his career could have taken a much different turn. It's one of those what-if moments that makes you wonder how things could have played out differently. Then there was the issue of steroids. Hercules was absolutely massive in the late 1980s, and it didn't take much to figure out why. He was never officially named in any of WWF's steroid scandals, but steroid use was everywhere in wrestling at the time. His sudden bulk up in 1986, right after joining Bobby Heenan's stable, raised plenty of eyebrows. Many believe he was a heavy steroid user, just like a lot of wrestlers from that era. It may have helped him look the part, but it likely took a toll on his health later in life. It was the price many wrestlers paid in that era, sacrificing long-term health for short-term success. And then there was his final match in WWF in 1992, when he no-sold Sid's powerbomb and walked out. It wasn't a major scandal, but it was a moment that wrestling insiders talked about. The whole business relies on wrestlers selling moves to make their opponents look strong. Ignoring the finish like that wasn't just a sign of frustration, it was seen as unprofessional. It wasn't the worst thing a wrestler had ever done, but it was one of those moments that showed the tension between Hercules and WWF management near the end of his run. It was almost as if he wanted to make a statement before walking away for good. Hercules never reached the very top of the wrestling world, but he still had a long career filled with memorable moments. He had the size, strength, and presence to be a major star, but for one reason or another, it just didn't happen. Maybe it was bad booking, maybe it was bad timing, or maybe he just got stuck in the wrong role for too long. Whatever the reason, he spent most of his career as the guy who made others look good. Even though he never became a world champion or a headliner, fans still remember him. His career had plenty of ups and downs, but through it all, he remained a tough, hard-working competitor who always gave it his all in the ring. He may not have been the biggest name in wrestling, but he was a part of it, and that's something no one can take away from him. Now here's another thing I want to share with y'all. Wrestling puts a lot of stress on the body, and Hercules had spent years pushing himself to the limit. He kept his body at an enormous 270 pounds of muscle, a size that took incredible effort to maintain. That meant long hours in the gym, an extreme diet, and possibly steroid use. He was one of the most physically intimidating wrestlers of his era, and keeping up that size wasn't easy. While he never had any injuries that forced him out of the ring for long, the years of punishment he put his body through were adding up in ways that weren't visible. Every night in the ring, his body absorbed the impact of slams, suplexes, and clotheslines. His muscles took the hits, but his joints, his bones, and, most importantly, his heart were bearing the brunt of it all. On the outside, he was a towering, muscle-bound warrior. On the inside, the years of stress, training, and possibly performance-enhancing substances were slowly taking their toll. After he retired from wrestling, the effects of all that strain began to show, though not in a way that anyone noticed right away. He had settled into a quieter life, spending time with his family and visiting schools to talk to kids about making good choices. Unlike some former wrestlers who found themselves lost without the spotlight, Hercules adjusted well. He wasn't caught up in scandals or addiction. From the outside, it looked like he was doing fine. That's why his death came as such a shock. No one expected it. He hadn't shown obvious signs of declining health. But the truth was, the years of heavy bodybuilding and the physical demands of wrestling had taken their toll on his heart, even if no one could see it. On March the 6th, 2004, Hercules passed away in his sleep at his home in Tampa, Florida. He was just 47 years old, only weeks away from his 48th birthday. His wife later confirmed that it was heart disease, most likely a heart attack that took him in the night. It was sudden and unexpected. One moment, he was there, strong as ever, larger than life, and the next, he was gone. The only small comfort was that he didn't suffer. He was at home, surrounded by his loved ones, and he passed peacefully. His family kept things private, and there wasn't a lot of public attention around his death at first. But when the news spread, it hit the wrestling world hard. He was still young, and he hadn't seemed sick. The fact that he was gone so suddenly made people realize just how dangerous the long-term effects of wrestling could be. Many wrestlers from the 1980s, especially those who built their careers around size and strength, faced hidden health risks that caught up with them later. It was a sobering reality. The business that had made him famous, that had built him into an icon of strength, had also taken something from him. The relentless training, the physical beatings, the pressure to be bigger and stronger, it had all contributed to the silent damage that ultimately took his life. Hercules was buried with military honors at the Florida National Cemetery in Bushnell, Florida. He left behind his wife and children, who had been his biggest focus after wrestling. Fans still remember him as one of the strongest, toughest wrestlers of his time. He was never the flashiest or the most famous, but he had earned the respect of both fans and fellow wrestlers. His death is often talked about when people discuss wrestlers who passed away too soon because of heart-related issues. His story serves as a reminder of just how much of a toll the wrestling business can take, even on someone who seems larger than life. Hercules spent years proving his strength in the ring, but in the end, it was a battle no one saw that took him. His legacy lives on, not just in the matches he fought, but in the memories of those who watched and respected him. Speaking of his legacy, what really made him stand out were his feuds. This segment is all about his iconic feuds. Before Hercules became a well-known name, he had to prove himself in smaller wrestling events, where young wrestlers learned the trade by taking on experienced veterans. One of his first big rivalries was against Harley Race, a man who had already become a wrestling legend. Race was tough, mean, and very skilled, and for Hercules, this was a huge test. At the time, Hercules was managed by Oliver Humperdinck, and their feud with Race was heated. Their fights often turned into wild brawls with neither man willing to give up. One night in a major match, Hercules interfered in one of Race's fights, leading to an all-out battle. The rivalry hit its peak when Race took out Humperdinck with a piledriver, shocking the audience. It was brutal, but it was also the kind of moment that got people talking. Even though Hercules was still new to the business, he was proving he could fight with the best. In the WWF, Hercules found himself in a bitter rivalry with Billy Jack Haynes. Both men were powerhouses, and both used the full Nelson submission hold, which made their feud even more intense. They both wanted to prove whose full Nelson was stronger, and neither was willing to admit defeat. Their fights were hard-hitting, with both men trying to overpower the other. The tension grew week after week, and when they finally faced off at WrestleMania 3 in 1987, it was in front of a huge crowd of over 93,000 fans. The match was tough, with both men trying to lock in their signature move. It ended in a double countout, which left fans unhappy, but Hercules wasn't done. As soon as the bell rang, he grabbed his steel chain and brutally attacked Haynes, wrapping it around his fist and hitting him again and again. Haynes was left bloodied and lying on the mat as Hercules stood over him. It was a violent move, and it showed that Hercules was not someone to mess with. Another big rivalry came in 1988 when Hercules faced the Ultimate Warrior. At the time, Warrior was quickly becoming one of wrestling's biggest stars, and his feud with Hercules was all about strength. In one unforgettable moment, Hercules wrapped his steel chain around Warrior's neck, trying to choke him out. But Warrior, in an amazing display of power, grabbed the chain and snapped it apart with his bare hands. The crowd went crazy. It was the kind of moment that stuck with fans, a perfect show of Warrior's superhuman strength. The two met at WrestleMania 4, where they fought in a fast-paced match. Hercules came close to winning, but in the end, Warrior reversed his full Nelson into a quick pin, barely escaping defeat. Though short, the feud helped show that Hercules was a serious competitor who could fight with one of the company's biggest rising stars. Later that same year, Hercules got involved in one of the most talked about stories of his career, this time with Ted DiBiase, the $1 Million Man. DiBiase was known for treating people like objects, buying whatever he wanted and embarrassing those who stood in his way. One day he announced that he had bought Hercules from his manager, Bobby the Brain Heenan. The meaning was clear. DiBiase saw Hercules as nothing more than property, but Hercules wasn't about to be owned by anyone. In a big moment, he turned on Heenan and DiBiase, standing tall in the ring as the crowd cheered. He made it clear that no man controlled him. The feud led to a series of intense matches, with DiBiase using every dirty trick to try to take Hercules down. Though DiBiase often found ways to cheat and escape, the storyline made Hercules a fan favorite almost instantly. He had gone from a feared bad guy to a fighter standing up for himself, and the fans loved him for it. By 1990, Hercules moved into tag team wrestling, teaming up with Paul Roma to form Power and Glory. Managed by Slick, they quickly became a dangerous team. They made an immediate impact by attacking the Rockers, Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty, before their match at SummerSlam. They injured Michaels' knee, leaving him struggling to compete, and then easily beat the Rockers in what many saw as an unexpected victory. That win made Power and Glory a serious threat in the tag team division. They had intense matches with teams like the Hart Foundation and even battled the Legion of Doom. Their biggest moment came at WrestleMania 7 when they faced the Legion of Doom. Fans expected a fight, but the match lasted less than a minute. The Road Warriors completely destroyed them, and just like that, Power and Glory's time as a top tag team was over. Hercules fought many big names throughout his career. He had a match against Ricky the Dragon Steamboat at WrestleMania 2, his first real moment in the national spotlight. He even challenged Hulk Hogan for the WWF Championship on an episode of Saturday Night's Main Event in 1986. That was one of the biggest matches of his career, even though he didn't win. He also had a short but fun feud with King Haku, another tough guy, and even managed to pin him at WrestleMania 5. But wrestling was changing, and new stars were taking over. By the mid-90s, Hercules was still wrestling, but he wasn't in the big matches anymore. He spent the last few years of his career wrestling in smaller promotions before retiring in 1999. But what comes to an end also once began in full glory. This next segment is all about how he started, how and what exactly he did to earn him some money. Raymond Constantine Fernandez, known to wrestling fans as Hercules Hernandez, was born on May 7, 1956, in New York City. His early years were a mix of love and struggle. When he was just 6, his mother passed away from cancer, a heartbreaking loss for any child. After that, his father moved the family to Tampa, Florida, hoping for a fresh start. It was in Tampa that Ray discovered his love for sports and competition. In high school, Ray found his passion for wrestling. He wasn't just strong, he was dedicated. He trained hard, building the strength and skills that would later help him in the world of professional wrestling. But wrestling wasn't his only interest. He was also serious about bodybuilding, working hard to build an impressive physique. His efforts paid off, and he was even featured in muscle magazines. After graduating in 1974, Ray decided to serve his country by joining the United States Air Force. He spent 3 years in the military, gaining discipline and improving his physical abilities. Even while serving in the Air Force, wrestling was always on his mind. The Florida wrestling scene was thriving, and Ray knew he wanted to be a part of it. He started training under Hiro Matsuda, a legendary trainer known for his intense workouts. Matsuda had trained some of the biggest names in wrestling, including Hulk Hogan. Under Matsuda's guidance, Ray learned the fundamentals of wrestling and prepared for the tough road ahead. Ray officially stepped into the wrestling world around 1979, performing in regional promotions in Florida and Texas under the name Hercules Hernandez. Back then, wrestling was divided into different territories, and wrestlers traveled from place to place to make a name for themselves. Ray spent these early years learning the business, building his character and proving himself in the ring. By 1982, he joined the NWA Central States promotion in Kansas City, where he started gaining recognition. In Central States, Ray quickly made an impact. He teamed up with Dewey Robertson, later known as the Missing Link, and together they won the NWA Central States Tag Team Championship twice. He also won the Central States Television Championship, holding it for more than 6 months. These early successes gave him confidence and solidified his place as a rising star in the business. Ray also had some memorable rivalries in Central States. One of his biggest feuds was with former NWA World Champion Harley Race. Their matches were intense, and their storyline led to a dramatic steel cage match that involved Ray's manager, Oliver Humperdinck. This feud got a lot of attention, and after a successful run, Ray decided to move on to new opportunities. In 1983, Ray joined Jim Crockett Promotions and took on a new persona as Masked Assassin No. 2. He teamed up with veteran wrestler Jody Hamilton, the original Masked Assassin, and together they became a feared duo. This role allowed Ray to wrestle on a bigger stage, and he even performed at the first ever Starrcade event in 1983. He and Hamilton won their match that night, marking a major milestone in his career. However, his time under the mask didn't last long. In 1984, during a match against Jimmy Valiant, Ray was unmasked, bringing his run as an assassin to an end. With this chapter behind him, he moved on to Mid-South Wrestling. When Ray arrived in Mid-South, he was given another masked persona, this time as the partner of Mr. Wrestling 2. Fans started calling him Mr. Wrestling 3 since he played the role of a young protege. He was involved in a major storyline with Magnum TA, but after a while he dropped the mask and returned to being Hercules Hernandez. Now back under his well-known name, he teamed up with manager Jim Cornette and entered a heated feud with fan favorite hacksaw Jim Duggan. Later he joined Skandor Akbar's villainous stable, Devastation Incorporated, where he worked alongside stars like a young Ted DiBiase. This time in Mid-South gave Ray valuable experience, allowing him to wrestle against top names like the Junkyard Dog and Terry Taylor. In early 1985, Ray returned to Florida to compete in championship wrestling from Florida. He made a strong impact, winning both the NWA Florida Southern Heavyweight Championship and the NWA Florida Heavyweight Championship, making him a double champion. However, his time in Florida ended suddenly after a locker room incident with wrestling legend Wahoo McDaniel. The two had a heated altercation, which led to Ray being fired and stripped of both championships. After this, he had a short run in Puerto Rico's World Wrestling Council and later moved on to world-class championship wrestling in Texas. In WCCW, he was managed by Sunshine and had a notable feud with Gino Hernandez. Fans found it interesting that two wrestlers with the same last name were facing off, even though they weren't actually related. By the end of 1985, Ray had built a strong reputation in the wrestling world. He had traveled across different territories, wrestled against some of the biggest names in the industry, and held multiple championships. He had proven himself as both a singles and tag team competitor, gaining valuable experience along the way. After years of hard work, he was ready for the next big step. That opportunity came when he signed with the World Wrestling Federation, marking the beginning of his journey on the national stage. The wrestling world was about to see Hercules Hernandez like never before. Hercules Hernandez made his WWF debut in November 1985, stepping into the world of big-time wrestling at a moment when the sport was exploding in popularity. Right from the start, he was managed by classy Freddie Blassie, a veteran with decades of experience in the business. For Hercules, this was a major step up. He had spent years working through different territories, but now he was on the biggest stage of them all. His first major moment came at WrestleMania 2 in April 1986. WrestleMania was still a new concept at the time, but it was already becoming the biggest event in wrestling. That year, the event was held in 3 different cities, and Hercules was booked to wrestle Ricky the Dragon Steamboat in Los Angeles. Steamboat was a fan favorite, known for his speed and technical skill, while Hercules was a powerhouse. The match was competitive, but Steamboat came out on top. Even though Hercules lost, just competing at WrestleMania gave him a major boost in recognition. Shortly after WrestleMania, things started shifting behind the scenes. Blassie retired, and his stable of wrestlers was passed to a new manager, Slick. During this time, Hercules struggled to find his footing. He had everything he needed to be a top star. He was strong, he had the look, and he could wrestle, but he didn't have a clear direction. That all changed later in 1986 when Slick sold Hercules' contract to Bobby the Brain Heenan, one of the most famous managers in wrestling history. With Heenan by his side, Hercules' career took off. He dropped the Hernandez from his name and changed his look completely. Gone was the Roman gladiator outfit. Instead, he came to the ring carrying a thick steel chain, which became his trademark. He also bulked up even more, making himself look even more intimidating. These changes worked, and soon Hercules was getting bigger matches against some of WWF's biggest names. One of the biggest opportunities of his career came on November 29, 1986, when he faced WWF champion Hulk Hogan on national television during Saturday night's main event. This was a huge deal for Hercules. Not many wrestlers got the chance to face Hogan, let alone in a title match on a widely watched program. During the match, Hercules managed to put Hogan in his backbreaker submission hold, making it look like he might actually win. But as always, Hogan found a way to escape and pinned Hercules. Even though he lost, just being in the ring with the champion on such a big stage raised his profile significantly. Around this time, Hercules got into a heated feud with Billy Jack Haynes, another strong wrestler who used the full Nelson as his signature move. Their rivalry became personal when Hercules, under Heenan's guidance, started using the full Nelson himself and claimed that his version was unbreakable. The two had several intense run-ins, including one memorable segment on WWF Wrestling Challenge, where Heenan challenged Haynes to escape Hercules' full Nelson. When Haynes came to accept the challenge, Hercules blindsided him, locked him in the hold, and refused to let go. Haynes was left injured, setting the stage for their big match at WrestleMania 3 in 1987. WrestleMania 3 was historic. Held in front of over 93,000 fans at the Pontiac Silverdome, it was the biggest wrestling event ever at the time. Hercules and Haynes went head-to-head in a brutal match that ended in a double countout when their fight spilled outside the ring. But the drama didn't stop there. After the match, Haynes snapped and locked Hercules in a full Nelson outside the ring. Heenan, seeing his man in trouble, interfered by kneeing Haynes in the back, giving Hercules just enough time to grab his steel chain. He swung it hard, smashing Haynes in the face and leaving him a bloody mess. The feud continued for a few more weeks, culminating in a violent chain match, which Hercules won. By early 1988, Hercules was still one of the top villains in Heenan's stable. That's when he crossed paths with a rising star, the Ultimate Warrior. Their feud began on an episode of WWF Superstars with an unforgettable moment. Hercules was swinging his chain when Warrior grabbed the other end. The two engaged in a tug-of-war with the chain until it suddenly snapped in half. The commentators made a huge deal out of it, saying Warrior's power alone had broken the chain. This infuriated Hercules and Heenan, leading to a match at WrestleMania 4. The match itself was short but intense. Hercules nearly won by locking Warrior in the full Nelson, but Warrior flipped over, landed on top of Hercules, and got the 3 count. The loss hurt Hercules' standing, as it was clear WWF was positioning Warrior as the company's new powerhouse. Later in 1988, Hercules' career took an unexpected turn. On an episode of WWF Superstars, Heenan announced that he had sold Hercules' contract to the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase. But this wasn't just another managerial switch. DiBiase claimed he had literally bought Hercules as his personal slave. The storyline took a dramatic turn when Hercules refused to be owned by anyone. In a shocking moment, he turned on both Heenan and DiBiase, swinging at them and becoming a fan favorite. Now a hero, Hercules set his sights on getting revenge on DiBiase. At Saturday night's main event in November 1988, he first had to go through DiBiase bodyguard Virgil. Hercules easily defeated Virgil, then chased after DiBiase, Zerania, who ran away to avoid him. Their feud continued into Survivor Series 1988, where they were on opposing teams. During the match, DiBiase managed to eliminate Hercules, But Hercules got the last laugh by distracting DiBiase and causing him to be eliminated moments later. With Heenan and DiBiase behind him, Hercules spent much of 1989 targeting members of the Heenan family. One of his biggest matches that year was against King Haku at WrestleMania 5. Haku was calling himself the king of the WWF, but Hercules managed to defeat him. Despite the win, Hercules never claimed the king title for himself. It was just another big victory in his career. By mid-1989, however, Hercules' momentum started to fade. World Wildlife Fund was bringing in new stars, and Hercules was now being used to make them look good. At WrestleMania 6 in 1990, he was crushed by Earthquake, a 400-pound monster. Around this time, he also started losing to technical wrestlers like Mr. Perfect. It was clear that his days as a singles contender were coming to an end. But then came a new opportunity. In the summer of 1990, Hercules turned heel again and formed a tag team with Paul Roma. They became Power and Glory. Hercules brought the power, while Roma brought the glory. Managed by Slick, they had great chemistry. Their biggest moment came at SummerSlam 1990 when they feuded with the Rockers. Before the match, Power and Glory ambushed Shawn Michaels, injuring him. With Michaels barely able to stand, Hercules and Roma dominated and easily won the match. For a while, it seemed like Power and Glory could be a serious tag team. They even challenged the Hart Foundation for the WWF Tag Team Championships. Their finishing move, the Powerplex, a superplex from Hercules followed by a big splash from Roma, was one of the best in WWF at the time. But their momentum didn't last. At WrestleMania 7 in 1991, they faced the Legion of Doom and were defeated in under a minute. After that, the team never recovered. Soon after, Roma left WWF and Hercules was on his own again. By late 1991, Hercules was being used as a veteran to help put over younger talent. He lost matches to the Bushwhackers, Big Boss Man, and even a young Bret Hart. His last major showing came in the 1991 Royal Rumble, where he lasted nearly 40 minutes. But by the 1992 Royal Rumble, his time in WWF was coming to an end. His final WWF match came against Sid Justice at Madison Square Garden. After losing, he simply walked out of the ring, signaling the end of his run. Shortly after, he left WWF, ending a 7-year career with the company. While he never won a championship, he left behind a legacy of great matches and unforgettable moments. By the early 90s, though, things started to change. World Wildlife Fund was moving in a new direction, and Hercules wasn't part of it. After years of being in the spotlight, his time there had come to an end. But wrestling was all he knew, and he wasn't ready to walk away. So in 1992, he went to WCW, hoping for a fresh start. But WCW didn't bring him in as Hercules. Instead, they gave him a new identity, the Super Invader. They put him in a red bodysuit and a mask, trying to turn him into a silent, dangerous assassin-type character. The problem was that wasn't who Hercules was. He wasn't some mysterious, sneaky fighter. He was a straight-up brawler, a guy who thrived on power and brute force. Fans didn't really buy into the new look, and it didn't feel natural. To help him out, WCW paired him with Harley Race, a legendary manager who could add credibility to just about anyone. He won some matches, including ones against Todd Champion and Marcus Bagwell. And he even got to be part of a big moment at Clash of the Champions 20. That night, he teamed up with Rick Rude, Jake the Snake Roberts, and Big Van Vader in an 8-man tag match. It was a huge opportunity, but it didn't last long. Sting eliminated him early. His team still won, but it wasn't exactly a breakout performance for Super Invader. Even with a few solid matches, the character never really took off. By the end of 1992, Hercules left WCW. He had spent years as a well-known name in wrestling, but now it seemed like his career in major promotions was over. But Hercules wasn't done yet. In 1993, he went to Japan. Wrestling in Japan was different from the US. It was more physical, more about the action in the ring than over-the-top storylines. And in Japan, he didn't have to be Super Invader. He could just be Hercules Hernandez again. He found success right away. He teamed up with Scott Norton, another powerhouse, to form the Jurassic Powers. These two were massive, strong, and fought with pure brute force. And they didn't waste any time making an impact. In August 1993, they had their biggest moment yet. They faced the Hellraisers, a team that included Road Warrior Hawk and Kensuke Sasaki, two of Japan's toughest wrestlers. It was a hard-hitting fight, but in the end, Hercules and Norton won the IWGP Tag Team Championship. This was huge. Hercules had spent years in WWF without ever winning a major title. Now he was a champion in one of the most respected wrestling promotions in the world. For months, he and Norton defended their titles against some of Japan's best teams. They fought the Steiner brothers, the Japanese Jolly Jacks, and even Haku and the Barbarian, two former WWF stars. They made it all the way to the finals of NJPW's Super Grade Tag League, but they lost to Keiji Muto and Hiroshi Hase, two Japanese wrestling legends. Then, in early 1994, they lost the IWGP Tag Team Championship back to the Hellraisers. Their reign as champions was over, but Hercules had proven something. He could still compete at a high level. He wasn't just a former WWF guy hanging on. He was a fighter who could go anywhere in the world and succeed. After Japan, he started winding down his career. He wrestled for some smaller promotions in the US, including IWCTW in 1993 and the American Wrestling Federation, AWF, in 1994. Through the late 90s, he still wrestled on the independent scene, taking matches here and there, sometimes overseas, sometimes in smaller US territories where longtime fans still remembered him. But by 1999, he was done. He had spent nearly 20 years in the business. Wrestling was changing. Younger stars were taking over. And after years of punishment in the ring, his body had been through too much. It was time to move on. After retiring, Hercules focused on his family. He had been married to his high school sweetheart, Debbie, since 1976, and together they raised 7 children: Nickel, Jeremy, Jacqueline, Amanda, Taylor, Caitlin, and Keith. He settled down in Florida, the place where he had grown up and first started wrestling. People who knew him later in life said he was humble and down to earth. He never let his past wrestling fame change who he was. He was just a normal guy who had done something special. But like many wrestlers from his generation, his body had taken a beating. He had spent years pushing himself hard, training intensely, wrestling through injuries, and using steroids, which were common in the industry at the time. By the early 2000s, he was struggling with heart disease. On March 6, 2004, Ray Hercules Hernandez passed away in his sleep. He was only 47 years old. His wife later confirmed that he died from heart disease, and many believe his years in wrestling, along with past steroid use, played a part in his early death. Unfortunately, he wasn't the only one. Many wrestlers from the 80s and 90s suffered the same fate. The business was tough, and a lot of wrestlers from that era paid the price with their health. Hercules was buried with full military honors at Florida National Cemetery. Before his wrestling career, he had served in the U.S. Air Force, and this was a way to honor his service. Even though he never won a world title in WWF, Hercules left a mark on wrestling. Fans still remember him swinging his chain, fighting some of the biggest names in the business, and delivering hard-hitting, brutal matches. But more than that, he was a family man, a husband, a father, a guy who gave everything he had to wrestling, but always stayed true to himself. His career had ups and downs, but in the end, he's still remembered. Fans still watch his matches, still talk about his moments in WWF and Japan, and still respect the mighty Hercules. And in wrestling, being remembered means everything. Hercules may never have been the top star in wrestling, but he left a lasting impact on the business. He had the look, the power, and the experience to be a major player. Yet for most of his career, he remained on the mid-card. Whether it was due to bad booking, timing, or simply being placed in the wrong role, he never quite broke through to the main event scene. Instead, he spent much of his time making other wrestlers look good. Despite this, he was a respected competitor who gave his all every time he stepped into the ring. His career had its highs and lows, from intense rivalries with stars like Billy Jack Haynes and the Ultimate Warrior, to his brief success with Power and Glory. He had moments where it seemed like he was on the verge of something bigger, only for circumstances to push him back down. Even after leaving WWF, his time in WCW as Super Invader failed to revive his career. By the mid-90s, he was out of the spotlight, wrestling in smaller promotions before retiring in 1999. While his in-ring career never reached the highest peaks, Hercules was still a name that fans remember. His battles, his power, and his dedication to the sport earned him respect, even if he was never world champion. And though his passing at just 47 years old was a tragic reminder of the toll wrestling can take, his legacy remains. He was a fighter, a powerhouse, and a competitor who always showed up ready for battle. And that's the story of Hercules, one of wrestling's toughest competitors who never quite got the push he deserved. What do you think? Should Hercules have been a bigger star? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on more wrestling history. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.